Circleville is your typical small town. It's quiet, peaceful, and low-key. Located halfway between Columbus and Chillicothe, the most famous thing that the town is known for is its annual Pumpkin Festival. That is until the late 1970s, when poison pen letters started circulating in the community. It sounds like one of Agatha Christie's novels, The Moving Finger, where people in the village started receiving poison pen letters. Just like the story, the Circleville Letters were full of accusations, claiming to know the deepest, darkest secrets of the residents that they didn't want anyone to know. For the most part, the letters were about the private sex lives of the recipients, though there were some that hinted at murder and false imprisonment. The letter writer threatened to reveal these secrets to the public if the recipients didn't stop what they were doing. It wasn't long before residents of the once peaceful, close-knit community started feeling wary around each other. A web of suspicion and fear surrounded the town. After all, who would know their secrets if it wasn't someone close to them? It is estimated that more than 1,000 letters were sent by the writer. Some were sent to ordinary citizens, others were sent to public officials and newspapers. All of them were postmarked Columbus, Ohio. Some had no return address, while others had a fake one. All the letters were written in distinctive block letters. No one knew who was sending the letters, and no one could predict when such a letter would suddenly appear in their mailbox. Who would have thought that these menacing letters would eventually lead to the destruction of a family and death? Join us as we take a deeper look into the Circleville Letters and the mystery surrounding them to find out what most likely happened. The anonymous poison pen letters started arriving in 1976. Many of the recipients didn't disclose the contents of the letters they received, if they even admitted to receiving one. In addition, it was impossible to prove that all of the allegations in the Circleville Letters were true. But it was reported that some of the letters contained truths known at the time to be true. Other allegations were only proven to be true years later. And then there were some accusations that were later debunked. Though it has never been revealed who was the resident to receive the first letter, there was one resident who seemed to have been targeted the most: Mary Gillespie. Mary was a local bus driver for the school district in Circleville. She was married and had 2 children. One day she received an anonymous letter that told her to stop her affair with the school superintendent, Gordon Massey. The letter also told her that the writer had been observing her house and was aware that she had children. Initially, Mary just kept the letters hidden away. She didn't tell anyone of their existence. Instead, she merely began to keep an eye on her surroundings. However, because of her inaction, the writer decided to send a letter to her husband, Ron. His letter exposed Mary's alleged affair with Gordon Massey. The writer even goaded Ron, stating, "You should catch them together and kill them both. He doesn't deserve to live." The author didn't stop there. In another letter to Ron, he said, "Gillespie, you have had 2 weeks and done nothing. Admit the truth and inform the school board. If not, I will broadcast it on CBS, posters, signs, and billboards until the truth comes out." Mary had assured Ron that the allegation was false. However, ignoring the letters seemed to make things worse for the Gillespies. Instead of stopping, the writer became even more threatening. The writer also started sending letters to the school's vice principal, informing him about the alleged affair. "I shall send you proof about driver number 62917. She has a child in school there now. I shall prove this shortly. I expect him to be discharged. You'll see that I am telling the truth." While the writer didn't send any proof after mailing the letter, the fact that he knew Mary's driver number meant that he was somehow connected to the school. At this point, even Gordon Massey was receiving poison pen letters. In his case, the threats involved slashing his tires and cutting his brakes if he didn't stop seeing Mary. Because of these threats, Ron and Mary decided to tell their family about the letters. They told Ron's sister Karen and her husband Paul Freshour about them. Paul worked at the local Anheuser-Busch plant, but he used to be a prison guard. He even survived a 30-hour ordeal as a hostage at the Ohio State Penitentiary years ago when the inmates briefly took over the prison. When the couple confided in the Freshours, Mary already had a suspect in mind, fellow bus driver David Longberry. He had once made a pass at her, but she rejected him. Mary thought that it was possible Longberry was taunting her because he was jilted. The two couples thought of a plan. Paul would write a letter to Longberry telling him that they knew he was the writer and that he should stop immediately. And the letters did stop, but only for a little while. It wasn't long before signs began appearing all over town. The signs stated that Gordon Massey was in a relationship with the Gillespie's 12-year-old daughter, Tracy. This enraged Ron, who started driving around town early in the morning before work to tear off the signs before his daughter could see them. They took the letters to the sheriff's office, who consequently conducted an investigation. It was reported that they watched houses and even tapped phones. They even tried to work with the USPS to find out where the letters were coming from, but the harassment didn't stop. On August 19, 1977, Ron received a phone call at home. According to reports, the caller told Ron that he had been watching their house for some time. After the call, Ron stormed out of his house with a .22 caliber revolver in hand. He told his daughter that he knew the identity of the Circleville letter writer, and he was to make him stop. Ron's truck was found later that night at 10:35 p.m. It had crashed into a tree. Ron was inside the truck, dead from major internal injuries. Authorities found that his gun had been fired, but they never found any bullet casing at the scene. More importantly, they discovered that Ron had a blood alcohol content of 0.16, which was twice the legal limit. Though friends and family claimed that Ron was not a heavy drinker, the police concluded that Ron's death was a drunk driving accident. Paul kept pushing the police to take a closer look. He believed that Ron had been murdered. He also believed that Ron had tried to shoot the writer. Unfortunately, the sheriff's office didn't think of investigating when and where Ron shot his gun. The department believed that this information was irrelevant to the incident. In addition, the sheriff told Paul that they did have one suspect before. But after that individual passed a polygraph test, they didn't pursue this line of inquiry anymore. At the time of Ron's death, Mary was in Florida with her sister. She was on vacation, trying to relieve all the stress caused by the poison pen letters. After Ron's death, Mary continued to receive letters. This time, the writer was taunting her and Gordon. "Everyone knows what you have done. If you don't believe us, just make them mad and find out for yourself." Aside from continuing to send letters to Mary, the writer suddenly started sending letters to other residents of Circleville. This time he was claiming that the sheriff had covered up the true cause of Ron's death. According to him, Ron was murdered by Mary and her lover Gordon Massey. In 1979, just 2 years after Ron's death, Gordon Massey got a divorce and started dating Mary Gillespie. Needless to say, this raised questions as to whether she really did have an affair with Massey. However, Mary denied these allegations. According to her, she and Massey had started their relationship only after Ron's death. Maybe it was because Mary and Massey's relationship was now in the open that the attacks against her became more extreme. On February 7, 1983, years after Ron's death, Mary was driving her bus when she saw a sign on a nearby fence that was targeting her daughter. She stopped and went to pull down the sign. However, when she tried to take it down, she discovered that it was booby-trapped. A gun was set to fire once the sign was taken down. When the authorities tried to trace the owner of the gun, they found that the serial number had been filed off. Fortunately, they were still able to find enough information to identify the owner. It turned out to be Paul Freshour, the brother-in-law. The discovery stunned the authorities and Mary. Why would Paul do this? They couldn't think of any reason why he would threaten his in-laws. In fact, Mary was still friendly with Paul, even though he had already gotten a divorce with Ron's sister, Karen. She couldn't believe that Paul would attempt to kill her. Paul, of course, maintained his innocence. While out on bail, he even had himself checked into the mental health center of the Riverside Hospital for examination. The police continued to look for evidence. They found that Paul had purchased a gun from a co-worker. They also discovered that Paul had taken a day off from work on February 7th, the same day that Mary found the booby trap. Another piece of evidence that the police connected to Paul was the industrial-sized chalk box that held the gun. It was a type of box that Paul had easy access to in his workplace. More importantly, handwriting experts claimed that samples of Paul's handwriting were a match for 391 of the letters and 103 postcards sent to the Gillespies and other residents of Circleville. However, Paul claimed that the sheriff had asked him to try and copy samples of the poison pen letters, which is why the handwriting matched. What about the gun then? Paul readily admitted to owning the gun, but he claimed that it had been stolen weeks earlier. It's just that he did not report it. The police found no evidence to support his statement. More importantly, he failed a polygraph test. Based on these pieces of evidence, Paul was indicted by a grand jury in March 1983 for attempted murder. His trial took place in October of the same year. Karen testified that Paul had written the Circleville Letters. She even provided evidence, letters she found hidden in their house. As for motive, Karen claimed that Paul hated Mary. He thought the world of Ron and began to hate Mary after Ron's death due to her affair with Massey. It only took a week before he was convicted and given the maximum sentence, 7 to 25 years in prison. The entire town of Circleville felt relieved. The nightmare was over. Unfortunately, the town's relief was short-lived. The residents continued to receive letters in their mailbox. Signs were also still appearing around town. The sheriff's office maintained that Paul was responsible, though he couldn't explain how Paul had sent out those letters. But the prison warden disagreed. According to him, Paul was being monitored. They inspected all of his incoming and outgoing mail. He also had no access to pen and paper. They even started monitoring his calls just to see if he had an accomplice. At some point, Paul was even placed in isolation to prevent any communication with the outside world. But the letters kept coming, and the signs kept appearing. Paul himself got a letter from the anonymous writer. "Now when are you going to believe you aren't getting out of there? I told you 2 years ago. When we set them up, they stay set up. Don't you listen at all?" In 1993, the case of the Circleville Letters was investigated by the show Unsolved Mysteries. Before the episode was even aired, the producers received a letter of their own. "Forget Circleville, Ohio. If you come to Ohio, UL sickos will pay." In 1994, Paul was let out of prison on parole. Coincidentally, the letters also stopped coming in the same year. Paul died in 2012. He went to his grave still fighting to prove his innocence. Before we get into the theories, we need to clarify one thing first. Paul was only convicted of attempted murder, but it was never established that he was the writer of the Circleville Letters. Moreover, it is not certain that the person who made the booby trap and the writer are one and the same person. With that in mind, we'll take a look at the theories of who set up the booby trap. Paul was convicted of the crime, but the evidence was insufficient. He had an alibi for the time when the trap was set. There were witnesses who saw him inside his home. He took the day off to have work done on his house. There was also no fingerprints on the box. More importantly, he didn't have a strong motive to kill Mary. According to Karen, Paul hated Mary for what happened to Ron. But it doesn't make sense that the brother-in-law would be so passionate about it when the sister didn't seem to bear the same hate. Moreover, Paul was often described as a loving family man. It seems unlikely that he would write something incredibly embarrassing and inappropriate about his niece and post it in public just to kill his brother-in-law's wife. In fact, Paul was so adamant about his innocence that he willingly cooperated with the show 48 Hours when they investigated the case. He even approached the FBI to ask for their help after he was released. Not only that, a former FBI profiler, Mary Ellen O'Toole, analyzed the Circleville Letters in 2021. According to her, the culprit had a controlling, vindictive personality. She also stated that, based on the word choices and the grammar, the writer was not a highly educated person. It was also possible that the writer was a female. More importantly, he didn't think that the writer would risk exposure by setting up a booby trap in a public place. Paul was a manager at Anheuser-Busch. He also possessed a master's degree. It's unlikely that a smart person like Paul would set up a booby trap that could easily be linked to him. And according to his friends and family, he did not have a dark side. He wasn't callous or bitter. One detail that came out in the early 1990s was that another bus driver had driven past the same spot where the booby trap was located 20 minutes before Mary found it. According to her, there was a man standing beside an El Camino. He was a large man with sandy hair, a description that didn't match Paul at all. He was not large, and he had very dark hair. But if the maker of the booby trap wasn't Paul, who could it be? Some people believed that it was David Longberry who was Mary's initial suspect. He did have a motive for hating Mary, and he was guilty of raping an 11-year-old girl in 1999. With this kind of temperament, it's not difficult to imagine that he had written the ugly words targeting Mary's daughter. Another suspect is William Massey. He was Gordon Massey's son, and he could have been aware of his father's affair long before his parents' divorce. Some of the Circleville letters were reported to have been signed with a W. Moreover, he had a motive for targeting Mary. Other people believe that it was Karen who used the booby trap to frame Paul. She was bitter because she lost everything after the divorce. With Paul in jail, she would gain custody of everything. Moreover, some residents reported that Karen was dating a man who fit the description of the person who was seen near the booby trap. Karen's brother was also reported to have owned an El Camino. Last but definitely not the least is Paul's son, Mark. According to private investigator Martin Yant, Paul suspected that his gun was taken by his son. And this was known to one of Paul's friends before the booby trap was found. Paul just didn't want people to know about it, so he said that it was stolen. In 2002, Mark killed himself due to depression. Based on the evidence we've collected, we definitely believe that the Circleville writer and the maker of the booby trap wasn't Paul. The most likely suspect for the booby trap is Karen and her boyfriend at the time. Aside from the fact that she had the strongest motive, she suddenly testified that Paul was the writer. Why did she never mention this fact before the divorce? She could have gotten the gun from Mark, which had affected his mental health, causing him to suffer from depression for years. But what about the identity of the Circleville letter writer? Based on the content of the letters, we can assume that the writer is someone local. Aside from knowing about Mary's affair, some of the secrets he exposed couldn't have been known by people outside of Circleville. The prosecutor of the trial, Roger Klein, was one of the targets of the writer. He was accused of killing a pregnant woman. The coroner who performed Ron Gillespie's autopsy was also a recipient of accusations. The writer claimed that he was a pedophile. It was discovered that there was some truth in these claims. Klein was discovered to have had an affair with the dead woman, and he was the father of her unborn child. As to whether he did murder her, it's a question that has yet to be answered. As for the coroner, Carroll, he was officially charged with 12 counts of gross immorality, sex crimes, corruption of a minor, pornography, obscenity, and indecent exposure in 1993. Looking at the secrets that came out, it is unlikely that only one person was sending the letters out. How could one person know so many hidden truths? What most likely happened is that one person started writing poison pen letters to a few residents. Once it became known to others, other people started writing them as well, targeting people they had problems with, but couldn't openly scold. As for who targeted Mary Gillespie, our vote goes to William Massey, Gordon's son. Mary's letters were the most vicious, indicating that the writer was truly angry and wanted her to stop. Of course, these are just our thoughts. Who do you think is the writer of the Circleville Letters? If you love our content and want to support the channel, feel free to check our web shop where you can find exclusive true crime merch brought to you by Bad Things.